He had come to end it, to speak the words that would sever their quiet, restrained union with surgical precision. But when the midwife looked up from his wife's bedside and said, "Your Grace, the Duchess is 7 months along," the Duke of Westford's carefully constructed world shattered in a single breath. If you've ever believed quiet love is unworthy of being fought for, this story is for you. Subscribe now, because the most painful heartbreaks come from what is never said. The marriage of Mark Coleman and Maria Blackwell had never been a love match, not in the way society understood such things. At 23, Maria had been what polite circles called suitable but unremarkable. The youngest daughter of a country gentleman whose fortunes had turned, possessed of gentle manners and an education befitting her station, but little else to recommend her in London's glittering marriage market. She had dark eyes that observed more than they revealed, a voice that rarely rose above a murmur, and a stillness about her that some mistook for serenity, but was, in truth, the careful self-containment of someone who had learned not to expect too much from the world. Mark had not expected to marry her. As Duke of Westford, with an ancient title and considerable fortune, he could have chosen from among the season's brightest jewels. Yet he had selected Maria after only 3 brief conversations, practical discussions about estate management, household economy, and the duties expected of a duchess. There had been no poetry, no passionate declarations, only respect, only duty. "You understand what is required, Miss Blackwell," he had said to her in her father's cramped drawing-room, his tone as measured as if discussing a business contract. "I need a wife who will manage my households with competence and discretion. In return, you will have security, position, and my protection. Nothing more can be promised." She had accepted with the same quiet dignity with which she did everything, her grey eyes searching his face for something he could not name. He had told himself her composure was evidence of practical wisdom. He had not allowed himself to wonder what hopes she might be harboring beneath that careful exterior. The wedding had been small, the wedding night briefer still, tender in its restraint, but absent of the warmth that might have nurtured something deeper. Mark had told himself it was better this way, safer, and he had been raised to believe that emotional dependence was weakness, that a duke must remain above the messy entanglements that destroyed lesser men. Then, 6 months after their wedding, everything had begun to unravel. It had started with a conversation Maria was never meant to hear. Mark's mother, the Dowager Duchess, had cornered him in his study, her dissatisfaction barely concealed behind aristocratic courtesy. "The marriage was made in haste, Mark. An heir seems unlikely with a wife so pallid in her affections. One wonders if you chose too hastily." Mark's response, sharp with frustration at his mother's meddling, at the pressure he felt, at his own confusion about the quiet woman who haunted his thoughts more than he cared to admit, had been carelessly brutal. "The matter is done, Mother. We must make the best of what circumstances allow." He had not known Maria stood just beyond the door. He had not seen her face pale, had not witnessed the way her hand pressed against her heart as if to keep it from breaking. He had only noticed, in the days that followed, that his wife had grown even quieter, even more distant, retreating into a silence so complete it felt like ice forming between them. Mark, proud and bewildered, had retreated in turn. If she would not speak, he would not press. If she preferred solitude, he would give her an abundance of it. Their marriage had become a dance of perfect, devastating politeness. 2 people circling each other in empty rooms, never touching, never truly seeing. The night before he had left for London, that last night they had shared the same roof, and the same quiet darkness, had been different. There had been something raw in the air between them, something aching and unspoken. Maria had come to his chamber, silent as always, and for one night they had reached for each other with a desperate tenderness neither could name. Then morning had come, and with it the familiar armor of silence. Mark had left for London, telling himself it was necessary. Business, Parliament, anything but the truth. That being no Maria, and not knowing how to bridge the chasm between them, had become unbearable. Months had passed. Letters had been exchanged, formal, distant things that conveyed information, but no feeling. Until Mark had convinced himself that the kindest thing he could do for them both was to end what had clearly become an intolerable fiction. That he had returned to the country estate with the documents already prepared, with the speech already rehearsed in his mind. Clean, merciful, final. And then Georgiana Andrew, the midwife, had spoken those 7 words that changed everything. "Your Grace, the Duchess is 7 months along." Maria sat behind the lace curtains, her figure unmistakably altered in the afternoon light, her face pale and impossibly young. She had not looked at him, had not spoken. The terror in her eyes had been answer enough. Mark had frozen there in the doorway, Duke of Westford, master of vast estates, commander of his own destiny, rendered utterly powerless by a truth he had never imagined. The child could only be his, and Maria had never told him. She had known what was coming, had seen it in the pity on Georgiana's face, it was in the whispered urgency with which the household staff had fallen silent at his arrival, in the set of her husband's jaw as he entered the room with papers in hand and devastation in his eyes. She had known, and she had prepared herself to lose everything. What she had not prepared for was the look of absolute anguish that crossed the Duke's face when he finally understood what his pride had nearly destroyed. To understand how a marriage could fracture so completely, one must return to its beginning, to the season when Maria Blackwell and Mark Coleman first met, when hope was still a dangerous, fragile thing. Mark Coleman had been 7 years old when his father taught him the lesson that would shape his entire life. The old Duke had found young Mark weeping in the nursery after his spaniel had died, without a word, for his father had gripped his shoulder, not to comfort, but to still, and delivered his verdict in a voice cold as marble. "Weakness invites exploitation, Mark. A duke cannot afford to need anything he might lose." From that day forward, Mark had learned to master himself with the same ruthless efficiency his father had mastered their estates. Tears were forbidden. Affection was indulgence. Love was the most dangerous liability of all. His mother, the Dowager Duchess, had been no warmer. Beautiful, accomplished, utterly remote. She had produced her heir and then retreated into a life of social triumphs and strategic alliances. Mark could not recall her ever touching him with tenderness. When he excelled at his studies, she offered approval. When he disappointed her, silence. He had learned early that her love, such as it was, came with conditions he could never quite satisfy. So he had become what they required, disciplined, controlled, impenetrable. He had told himself it was strength. He had believed it was survival. Until Maria. He had noticed small things first, things a man trained to need nothing should never have noticed. The way she took her tea without sugar. The book of poetry she kept on the drawing-room table, its spine carefully mended. The fact that she walked the East Garden every morning at precisely 8 o'clock, regardless of weather. He began finding excuses to be in the East Garden at 8 o'clock. When business called him to London for a week, he found himself distracted during meetings, wondering if Maria had noticed his absence, if she missed their silent companionship at breakfast, and if she looked for him in empty rooms the way he had begun, unwillingly, to look for her. It terrified him. This was precisely the dependence his father had warned against, this soft, insidious need that made a man vulnerable. Mark fought it with the only weapon he knew, distance. If he did not allow himself to need her, he could not be destroyed by losing her, but the strategy had backfired spectacularly. His coldness had driven Maria away. His silence had been mistaken for indifference, and his mother, watching their stilted interactions with aristocratic disdain, had begun her campaign. The marriage must produce an heir, Mark. If the current Duchess cannot fulfill her primary duty, arrangements can be made. Quietly, of course. The words had filled him with a fury he could not name and dared not examine. He would not set Maria aside. But neither could he admit why the thought of losing her felt like losing air. So he had said nothing, and lost her anyway. Maria had been on her way to the library when she heard her husband's voice through the half-open study door. She should have announced herself, should have knocked or coughed or done anything to signal her presence. Instead, she froze, caught by the sharp edge in Mark's tone, a rawness she had never heard directed at her, but recognized now as barely contained frustration. The marriage was made in haste, Mother. His voice carried the weight of admission, of regret. I see that now. Maria's hand found the wall, steadying herself against something solid as the floor seemed to shift beneath her feet. The Dowager Duchess responded, her words clipped with aristocratic precision. And an heir, Mark. Well, surely you must address the situation. The girl has been your wife for 6 months, and still an heir seems unlikely. Mark's interruption was brutal in its finality. I cannot force what clearly does not exist. Maria did not hear the rest, could not hear past the roaring in her ears, past the crushing weight settling over her chest. Made in haste, as if their marriage had been a mistake requiring correction. An heir seems unlikely, as if she were the failure, the deficiency, the problem that could not be solved. She had known, of course, that Mark had not married her for love, but she had believed, foolish, desperate girl, that perhaps affection might grow between them, that the quiet mornings in the garden, the evenings spent in companionable silence, and the rare moments when his eyes softened as they rested on her face might mean something. She had been wrong. Maria retreated to her chambers with the careful dignity of someone trying not to shatter in public. Only when the door closed behind her did she allow herself to sink onto the window seat, her reflection in the glass showing a woman pale and small and utterly dispensable. She stopped seeking Mark out, stopped hoping he might notice her absence. When they passed in corridors, she offered polite acknowledgement and nothing more. At meals, she spoke only when addressed. In the evenings, she retired early, pleading headaches that were not entirely feigned. Mark noticed. How could he not? But what he saw in her withdrawal, he interpreted as confirmation of his worst fears, that Maria had never wanted this marriage, that her quietness masked resentment, that she was simply enduring an arrangement she found as burdensome as he apparently did. He matched her distance with his own, pride preventing him from asking what had changed. If she preferred solitude, he would grant it. If she wanted separation, he would not demean either of them by clinging. The night before he left for London, something broke in the careful architecture of their avoidance. Maria appeared at his chamber door after midnight, a ghost in white linen, her dark eyes luminous with something that might have been desperation or courage or simply the inability to endure another moment of silence. They did not speak, did not need to. Mark reached for her, and she came to him with a quiet fierceness that felt like drowning and salvation all at once. In the darkness, and without words to ruin it, they were simply two people reaching across an unbridgeable distance, tender and aching and hopelessly, silently lost. By morning, the armor was back in place, and Mark was gone. If you've ever lost something precious because pride kept you silent, subscribe now. Stories like this don't just entertain, they remind us what silence costs. Maria discovered the truth 6 weeks after Mark left for London. She had suspected for a fortnight, the persistent nausea, the exhaustion that made even simple tasks feel monumental, the way her body felt foreign to itself. But suspicion and certainty were different creatures entirely, and when Mrs. Hewitt, the housekeeper, had quietly suggested sending for the midwife, Maria's hands had trembled so violently she'd had to clasp them behind her back. As Georgiana Andrew arrived on a grey afternoon, carrying her worn leather bag and an air of unflappable competence that made Maria want to weep with relief. She was perhaps 40, with steady hands and eyes that missed nothing but judged even less. The examination was brief, the verdict devastating in its simplicity. "You're with child, Your Grace. Nearly 2 months along, I'd estimate." Maria had nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in her throat. She should have felt joy, should have felt anything other than the cold dread that spread through her chest like winter frost. "Does His Grace know?" Georgiana's voice was gentle, careful. "No." The word came out barely above a whisper. And he must not. Georgiana had studied her then with those perceptive eyes, seeing far too much, but she had only nodded. "As you wish, Your Grace. I am at your service." The months that followed were an exercise in careful deception. Maria let out her gowns gradually, wore shawls and loose morning dresses, avoided the staff's curious glances. She walked the east garden in the early mornings when no one else stirred, her hand pressed against the subtle swell of her belly, feeling the first flutter of life and wondering how something so precious could fill her with such terror. She feared Mark would discover the truth and feel trapped, bound to a wife he had married in haste by a child he had never wanted. She feared he would take the baby and send her away, leaving her alone with nothing but the memory of one aching night. She feared most of all being unwanted in a world where she had already felt herself invisible. The Mark's letters came sporadically from London. Formal inquiries about the estate, brief mentions of parliamentary business, nothing that suggested he thought of her at all beyond duty. Maria did not tell him she read each one multiple times, searching for warmth that was never there. Did not tell him she kept them in her desk drawer like talismans against loneliness. At night, alone in chambers that felt too large and too empty, Maria would rest her hand on her growing belly and whisper apologies to the child she already loved with a fierceness that terrified her. "I'm sorry," she would murmur into the darkness. "I'm sorry your father doesn't know you exist. I'm sorry I'm too much of a coward to tell him. I'm sorry you'll be born into this silence." The baby would flutter in response, but innocent and unaware that its very existence might destroy the fragile thing Maria had left to protect. Mark returned to Westford Hall on a cold October morning with documents folded inside his coat pocket and a speech rehearsed to the point of numbness. The separation would be discreet, generous. Maria would retain her title and receive a considerable annual income. She could live at the estate or choose another property entirely, whatever brought her peace. He would not contest whatever arrangement she preferred, would not make demands or create scandal. It was, he had convinced himself during the endless journey from London, the kindest thing he could do for them both. Better a clean break than this slow suffocation of a marriage that satisfied neither of them. The estate felt different as his carriage rolled up the drive. Colder, somehow, though the season hadn't changed that drastically. The servants who greeted him seemed subdued, their usual efficiency shadowed by something Mark couldn't quite name. Worry, perhaps. Or pity. Mrs. Hewitt curtsied, her face carefully neutral. "Your Grace, we did not expect you. I sent word 3 days ago." "Yes, Your Grace. Of course." She hesitated, glancing toward the stairs. "Her Grace is resting. Perhaps you might wait in the study while I—" "No." Mark's voice came out sharper than intended. He had rehearsed this moment too many times to lose momentum now. "I'll speak with her immediately." He climbed the stairs with the grim determination of a man walking toward execution, aware of servants pausing in doorways, of whispered conversations ceasing as he passed. The air felt thick with secrets he couldn't decipher. And outside Maria's chambers, he paused only long enough to steady his breathing before pushing open the door. The room was dim, afternoon light filtering through lace curtains that cast delicate shadows across the floor. Maria sat in a chair near the window, her profile to him, her figure partially obscured by the gauzy fabric. She wore a loose morning dress in pale grey, her dark hair pinned simply at the nape of her neck. She did not turn at his entrance, did not acknowledge him at all. Another woman stood near Maria's chair, not a maid, but someone older, with capable hands and an assessing gaze that fixed on Mark with unexpected intensity. The midwife, he realized, though he could not recall her name or why she would be present in the middle of the afternoon. "Your Grace." The woman's voice was calm, professional. "We did not expect you." "So I've been told." Mark's attention remained fixed on his wife's motionless figure. Something about her posture seemed different, fragile in a way that made his chest tighten with unwelcome concern. "Maria, I need to speak with you. There are matters we must discuss." Still she did not turn. Her hands rested in her lap, clasped tightly together. The midwife stepped forward slightly, positioning herself between Mark and Maria with subtle protectiveness. Her expression shifted, assessment giving way to something that looked disturbingly like warning. "Your Grace," she said quietly, "perhaps you should sit down." Mark's hand tightened on the documents in his pocket. "That won't be necessary. What I have to say will not take long." The woman glanced at Maria, some silent communication passing between them, which then she looked back at Mark, and her next words fell into the room like stones into still water. "Your Grace, the Duchess is 7 months along." Time fractured. Mark heard the words, 7 months along, but they made no sense, belonged to no reality he recognized. His hand released the documents. He watched them flutter to the floor with strange detachment, as if observing someone else's life collapse in slow motion. "That's—" His voice emerged rough, unfamiliar. "That's impossible." But even as he spoke, his eyes found Maria through the lace curtains. Really saw her for the first time since entering the room, the way her dress fell loosely over an unmistakable curve, the protective way her hands cradled her belly, the pale exhaustion etched into features he had once memorized in darkness. 7 months. The calculation crashed through him with brutal precision. 7 months ago, he had been here. They had been together. That last night before he left, desperate and silent and achingly tender. Maria. Her name broke on his lips. He moved toward her without conscious thought, but Georgiana stepped firmly into his path. "Your Grace, I must ask you to remain calm." Calm. The word was absurd. Mark's entire world had just inverted, and this woman expected calm. "Why didn't you tell me?" The question emerged as accusation, as anguish, as something that might have been grief. "Why in God's name didn't you—" "Because I heard you." Maria's voice cut through his spiraling thoughts, quiet and devastated. She turned finally to face him, and the tears streaming down her pale cheeks hit him like a physical blow. "I heard you tell your mother that our marriage was made in haste, that an heir was unlikely, that I was—" Her voice cracked, "that I was the problem that could not be solved." Memory slammed into Mark with sickening clarity. The conversation in his study, his mother's needling questions, his own frustrated response, meant as deflection, as self-protection. Oh God. "Maria, no, that's not— I didn't mean— I thought you would feel trapped." The words tumbled from her now, months of silence breaking like a dam. "I thought you would take the baby and send me away. I thought—" A sob cut through her composure. "I thought I was unwanted, and I couldn't bear for our child to be unwanted too." Mark's legs gave out. He found himself on his knees before he registered moving, the formal posture of a duke abandoned entirely. On the documents he'd brought, the carefully worded separation agreement, lay scattered at his feet like accusations. He had come here to end their marriage. While his wife carried his child in terrified silence, while she believed herself unloved, while she prepared to face everything alone. "I'm sorry." The words felt pathetically inadequate. "Maria, I'm so sorry. I never meant—" "Your Grace." Georgiana's voice cut through with professional urgency. The Duchess's condition is delicate. Shock and distress at this stage could cost her the child. I must insist that you— No. Mark's gaze remained locked on Maria's tear-stained face. No, I'm not leaving. I'm never leaving again. He reached for his wife's hand, and when she didn't pull away, when her fingers trembled in his grasp like something fragile and precious and nearly lost, and Mark Coleman finally understood the true cost of silence. If this moment made your chest tighten, don't walk away. Subscribe now, or tell us in the comments why stories about regret hit so close to home. Georgiana withdrew with quiet discretion, closing the door behind her and leaving them alone in the lace-filtered afternoon light. Mark remained on his knees before Maria's chair, her hand still clasped in his. He could feel her pulse fluttering beneath his thumb. Rapid, fragile, alive. The woman he had nearly lost through sheer stupidity and pride. I need you to understand something. His voice came out raw, stripped of every careful defense he'd spent a lifetime constructing. When I spoke to my mother that day, I was not speaking about you. I was speaking about myself, about my own failures, my own inability to— He swallowed hard. To tell you that you had become everything I never knew I needed. Maria's breath caught. Mark, let me finish. Please. He lifted her hand to his lips, pressed a kiss to her trembling fingers. I was raised to believe that needing anyone was weakness, that love made men vulnerable, destructible. So when I found myself watching for you in empty rooms, listening for your footsteps in the corridor, missing you every moment we were apart, I was terrified. A tear slipped down Maria's cheek. Mark reached up to catch it with his thumb, his touch achingly gentle. I thought distance would protect me, he continued. I thought if I could master my feelings, control them, I could avoid being destroyed by them. Instead, I destroyed us. His voice broke. I nearly destroyed everything that mattered. I thought you regretted marrying me. Maria's whisper was barely audible. I thought I was a burden you endured out of duty. When I discovered the baby, I was so afraid. She pressed her free hand to her belly. Afraid you would feel trapped. Afraid you would take our child and send me away. Afraid that if I told you, you would finally have reason enough to end what you never truly wanted. Never wanted. Mark's laugh was harsh with self-recrimination. Maria, I have wanted you from the moment you agreed to marry me. I have loved you, badly, silently, impossibly, since the first morning I found you in the East Garden and realized that the world felt empty when you weren't in it. Her composure finally shattered completely. Maria bent forward, her forehead resting against his, and tears flowing freely now. I love you. I have loved you through every terrible silence, every lonely night. I thought I would raise this child alone, believing myself unwanted, rather than risk hearing you confirm what I feared most. Mark pulled her closer, carefully mindful of the precious life between them. You are wanted. You are loved. Both of you, desperately, completely. He drew back just enough to meet her eyes. Those documents I brought were separation papers. I came here today to end our marriage because I believed it was mercy. I was wrong about everything. What will you do with them? Mark's answer was immediate. Burn them. For the first time in 7 months, Maria smiled. Mark Coleman had spent his entire life mastering the art of command. But what he learned in the weeks that followed was something far more difficult, the art of presence. He attended every visit from Georgiana Andrew, sitting beside Maria's chair as the midwife checked her health and the baby's position. He asked questions that would have embarrassed his former self, about nutrition and rest and what signs might indicate distress. He memorized Georgiana's answers with the same intensity he'd once applied to estate ledgers and parliamentary procedure. When Maria tired easily, which she often did, Mark carried her to the drawing room rather than let her climb stairs alone. When she struggled to sleep, restless with the baby's movements and her own discomfort, he read to her, poetry at first, then novels, then anything that made her smile. And he discovered she liked Gothic romances and had a weakness for happy endings. He discovered she hummed while arranging flowers. He discovered 1,000 small truths about his wife that 7 months of marriage had never revealed, simply because he had finally learned to pay attention. The servants noticed. Of course they noticed. The Duke, who had once maintained careful distance, now accompanied his wife on morning walks, his hand steady at her elbow. He took meals with her instead of in his study. He dismissed visitors who might tire her and postponed business that could wait. Society noticed too. When word inevitably spread that the Duchess of Westford was with child and that the Duke had returned from London to personally oversee her welfare, the whispers began anew. But this time they carried a different tone. Admiration, perhaps, and was simply surprise that the reserved Duke of Westford had proven capable of such devoted tenderness. Lady Pemberton, who had once predicted the marriage would be all duty and no warmth, revised her assessment entirely after witnessing Mark's fierce protectiveness when she called uninvited during Maria's afternoon rest. "The Duke looked as though I'd threatened his very soul," she reported to the other ladies with barely concealed delight. "One does not often see such devotion among the aristocracy." Maria bloomed under the attention. The pale, withdrawn woman who had hidden herself in loose dresses and solitary walks gradually transformed into someone radiant. She laughed more easily, spoke with growing confidence, made plans for the nursery with an enthusiasm that made Mark's chest ache with love and regret for the months they'd lost. And one evening, as they sat together in the drawing-room, Maria embroidering baby gowns while Mark pretended to read parliamentary reports, she looked up suddenly. "You're staring." "I am," he admitted without shame. "Why?" "Because I nearly lost this." "Nearly lost you." He set aside his papers. "I'm simply reminding myself that I'm here. That we're here. Together." Maria smiled, radiant and sure. "We are." And for the first time in his carefully controlled life, Mark Coleman understood what it meant to truly stay. The storm arrived with Maria's labor on a November night that turned the sky black as ink. Mark heard her cry out from 3 rooms away. He was at her door before the sound faded, before propriety or protocol could intervene, before anyone could tell him that dukes did not belong in birthing chambers. "Your Grace." "Mrs." No, Hewitt blocked his path, her face pale with worry and convention. "This is no place for move." The single word carried such absolute command that the housekeeper stepped aside without further protest. Inside, Maria gripped the bedpost, her face contorted with pain. Georgiana worked with swift efficiency, calling for hot water and clean linens, her calm a stark contrast to the chaos of the storm battering the windows. "Mark," Maria's voice broke on his name. "You shouldn't." "I'm not leaving." He crossed to her side, taking her hand in his. Never again. The hours that followed were the longest of Mark's life. He had faced financial crises, political battles, the death of his father, all with the same controlled composure drilled into him since childhood. But watching Maria struggle, or hearing her cry out in pain he could not prevent or share, unmade him completely. He held her hand through every contraction, whispered reassurances he desperately hoped were true, prayed to a God he'd rarely addressed with such raw urgency. "I can't." Maria's sob cut through him. "Mark, I can't." "You can." He pressed his forehead to hers, anchoring her with his presence. "You are the strongest person I know, and I am here. I'm right here." Thunder shook the house, rain lashed the windows, and then, in the darkest hour before dawn, a new sound broke through the storm, a baby's cry, thin at first, then stronger, furious and alive, and absolutely perfect. Georgiana worked quickly, and then she was turning, a small bundle cradled in her capable hands. "Your Grace, your son." Mark's hands trembled as he took the infant. Impossibly tiny, impossibly real. dark hair plastered to a wrinkled forehead, eyes squeezed shut against the unfamiliar world, fingers curled into fists no larger than walnuts. His son, the child he had never known existed until 2 months ago, the child Maria had carried in terrified silence, the child who had nearly been born into a broken marriage. Mark wept. Great shuddering sobs that shook his entire frame. No dignity, no control. Just a man utterly undone by love and gratitude and the crushing weight of what he had nearly destroyed through pride and silence. "Let me see him." Maria's exhausted whisper drew him back. Mark carefully placed their son in her arms, watching her face transform with wonder as she counted fingers and toes with trembling hands. "He's perfect," she breathed. "Like his mother." Maria looked up, tears streaming down her face, and smiled with such radiance that Mark knew, whatever darkness they had survived, whatever mistakes had nearly broken them, this moment made them whole. Spring returned to Westford Hall with a gentleness that felt like benediction. In the east garden, where Maria had once walked alone, she now walked with Mark, their son bundled against the morning chill. They spoke of small things, the estate, the nursery, plans for summer, but beneath the ordinary conversations lay something extraordinary. A marriage rebuilt from honesty instead of duty, from forgiveness instead of expectation. Society whispered, as society always did, but the whispers now carried admiration for the Duke who had learned to love openly and the quiet Duchess who had found her voice. And in the shadows of the manor, Georgiana Andrew watched them pass, in her midwife's bag packed and ready for the next household in need. She smiled, knowing what they had forgotten in their happiness, that truth, however painful, had saved them all. Sometimes the marriage we're ready to end is the one we were always meant to fight for. Thank you for watching.